Did the Pope cite established Catholic dogma on the just war theory by a
You're
prominent state?
questioning the
He
Pope
did.
citing?
Yes. Yeah, I am actually.
Catholic
You're allowed
dogma?
to. You're allowed to do that.
Well, look, and then so did J.D. Vance.
We just witnessed another far-right MAGA meltdown. This time, it was Joe Borelli appearing on Abby Phillips' show, with Sarah Seidner stepping in as host. Joe Borelli completely twisted his own logic into knots, backing himself into a corner with his non-stop defense of the so-called dear leader, Donald Trump. We're about to break down clips from this absolutely hilarious panel featuring Joe Borelli, S.E. Cupp, and the rest of the group. I've got some thoughts on this that I definitely want to share with you. Let's get into it.
Hey there, I'm Sarah Seidner in New York. America has a come-to-Jesus moment of sorts, but in politics, after a week of surreal events involving the Trump administration using religion to hit back at scrutiny of its war with Iran. The president deleted a picture depicting himself as Jesus after a bipartisan backlash.
I thought it was me as a doctor and had to do with Red Cross as a Red Cross. It's supposed to be me as a doctor making people better.
He posted another picture, this time of the two hugging. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth likened Trump to Jesus, calling reporters the enemies of Christ.
As the passage ends, the Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel against him, how to destroy him. I sat there in church and I thought, our press are just like these Pharisees.
Hegseth wasn't the only one who compared Trump to Christ.
I believe that Donald Trump is better than sliced bread. I think he's almost the second coming, in my humble opinion.
And in a twist, a Hollywood script entered the chat when Hegseth used a classic Tarantino movie quote during a prayer.
We often look somewhere else and look at trials through the wrong lens, and Jesus understands what kind of recipe we need for his purpose. Which leads me finally to a prayer that I'll read, which was also handed to me a couple of days ago.
And here, Pete Hegseth goes on to recite that so-called prayer from Pulp Fiction, you know, the one written by Quentin Tarantino. I actually had to cut this entire section out of my video because it got flagged for copyright, and honestly, I don't even think it was Quentin Tarantino who claimed it. It was some random name I didn't even recognize, but because of that claim, I had no choice but to skip over this part completely since it's copyrighted.
The Pentagon says Hegseth used a quote given to him by pilots involved in the rescue of the airmen in Iran. This was just the backdrop to a holy war of words between the Vatican and the United States. The president picked fights with the Pope after Leo called for peace and an end to the violence and warned about tyrants using religion for military gain. Trump's allies then began to lecture the Vatican.
I think it's very, very important for the Pope to be careful when he talks about matters of theology. You've got to make sure it's anchored in the truth.
The Pope needs to keep his business into leading his flock, so to speak, leading the church, and probably stay out of the political arena.
A pontiff or any religious leader can say anything they want, but obviously if you wade into political waters, I think you should expect some political response, and I think the Pope's received some of that.
So at this point, suddenly Republicans don't want religion in politics. Now to our table, what's with the holy war? I guess first to you, Joe.
Well, look, going to the Pope, I think Speaker Johnson's comments were probably the best. If the Pope is going to use his office and his place as not just a religious head, but as a head of state to engage in politics, you should expect some incoming back. And I'm actually, I think back to Pope Pius VII in World War II, who gets criticized for not speaking up against Nazi atrocities, the genocide against Jews. And I am wondering why the Pope doesn't make more stronger statements against what's happening within Iran, within the regime, the behavior that they've exemplified over the last 40 years. Look, I'm not saying, the situations are the same, but it is weird to have a pope only taking the side of Iran and not criticizing them for their atrocities.
It probably is not fair to say he's taking the side of Iran. He is quoting
takes the side of peace.
If you're taking one side,
quoting scripture, and he's talking about peace.
Trump's mic drop moment was when he was asked about 4 protesters Iran is going to plan to kill over the next day or two, and he said, ask the Pope. And he's right, the Pope has not weighed in on that. So to have the Pope weigh in, look, there is a long Catholic tradition of popes weighing in on politics. We expect the Pope to weigh in on peace, to support peace. I expect the Pope even to weigh in on the migrant crisis and things like that. But you have a war that's prosecuted against the number one state sponsor of terrorism, a state that uses its proxies to murder innocent civilians everywhere, a state that has murdered, by conservative estimates, 30,000 people within the last year. Maybe save the outrage for them, Your Eminence.
So, render unto Caesar.
So Joe Borelli starts bringing up World War II, and right away, that comparison falls apart. These are not comparable wars. The United States was directly attacked by Japan. The United States was not attacked by Iran. No matter what Joe Borelli and Scott Jennings and all these other MAGA sycophants keep saying on Abby Phillips' show, talking about 47 years, state sponsors of terrorism, and all of that, the simple fact is, Iran did not attack the United States. The U.S. entered World War II because Japan launched an attack on America. So again, these situations are not the same. Iran posed no direct threat to the United States in that moment. This was an offensive and, as many argue, an illegal war of choice driven by Donald Trump. That's the reality. So it's honestly confusing why people like Joe Borelli act surprised that the Pope would oppose something like that. Bombing schools, hospitals, and critical infrastructure. Of course the Pope is going to be against that. That wasn't self-defense. That wasn't America responding to an attack. And honestly, it's kind of unbelievable that figures like Pete Hegseth and Troy Nehls are in the positions of power they hold. These are individuals who, frankly, don't come across as capable of managing something as basic as a car wash, and no disrespect at all to people who actually run car washes. And then you look at the crowd of military personnel when Pete Hegseth says, "Let's pray." You can even spot a few of them laughing, almost like they realize what's happening, that he's literally quoting Pulp Fiction like it's some serious moment.
Right? I mean, this is the ultimate underlying point. All of a sudden, we see the Trump administration trying to misuse faith for political purposes almost every day, including the posts of the president comparing himself to Jesus. And yet, when the Pope actually talks about New Testament values of promoting peace against a preemptive war, which is not a condoning what executions in Iran at all, then all of a sudden he's on the wrong side of the politics. And so he gets demonized. And they basically say, shut up and dribble.
Do you think Iran's not responsible for proxy wars that have been existing for 40 years?
Of course they do. But that's like literally nothing to do with the larger
nothing
point.
to do. Come on.
Literally nothing.
Nothing?
Literally
That's
nothing
a
to do
stretch,
with it.
John.
No, Joe, no,
Nothing?
no,
Come on.
Look, here's why. When you get Pete Hegseth, who misquotes the Bible by quoting from a fake verse, pious and bringing religion into the Pentagon every day, quoting something from Pulp Fiction, it's a perfect encapsulation of the problem. They're trying to weaponize faith. They're trying to weaponize faith and fundamentally misunderstand it. And that's the endemic problem.
Trump doesn't understand religion or Christianity. He has no fluency with it. It's not a second, third, fourth language. He doesn't know it at all. And what he didn't get was that Catholics are very different from evangelicals. And Catholics only voted for Trump by 50% in 2016, 55% in 2024. And Catholics' read on the Bible is very different from an evangelical worldview. In evangelicalism, you've got prosperity theology, you've got preachers who say, give me millions of your dollars so that I can live in a big mansion. Catholics eschew that. And so to see Trump and Hegseth's and J.D. Vance's interpretation of the Bible and Jesus and Scripture being so sacrilegious turns off Catholics in a way it does not necessarily turn off evangelicals. And to lose a Catholic base when he's already losing among independents, among young people, among men, among Hispanics, he just can't afford it.
Go ahead.
Call me old-fashioned. I harken back to a time where we talked about the separation of church and state. I don't want it's in the Constitution, by the way. I don't want our leaders promoting any religion. I'm not a Christian, but I don't think my religion's better than any other religion. I don't think Christianity's better than any other religion. The military, by the way, has people of all religions. Muslims, by the way, which the president insulted horrendously just a week ago. And just think about our opponents, the Iranians. That's a theocracy. Yep. That's what we're against.
That's what we don't.
And thank God, pun intended. Yeah, bad pun, I know. But then you've got Josh Rogan coming and saying, we're supposed to be a secular country. We're supposed to have a separation of church and state. All of you, Joe Borelli, and the rest of the MAGA crowd, you're supposed to understand that basic principle. The idea is simple: separation of church and state.
We're for pluralism, we're for democracy, we're for people having whatever religion they want, but not making it part of our military or our government, because that's not what America is.
Because we were talking about support and what's going on, I want you to listen to what we're hearing from some folks who were big Trump supporters. Take a listen, and you mentioned Benny Johnson. He happens to be in this as well.
It's completely inappropriate, and he knows it. I don't know why the president's getting so desperate for attention that he feels the need to mock 1.4 billion Catholics. It's enough, okay? It's enough with this nonsense.
I'm also offended when anyone projects themselves as Christ.
We should not have a president who gleefully blasphemes the faith of, by far, the vast majority of his supporters.
Joe, do you think this was a mistake? Just a big, ugly mistake?
I think the president thought it was a mistake, and certainly I do. He took it down. That was the right thing to do.
But then he lied about it.
Look. You know, last week the gospel was about doubting Thomas, and doubting Thomas is the guy who had to, see it to believe it. You said that Catholics were abandoning Donald Trump. I was at a Catholic gala. Yeah, you literally said Catholics were abandoning.
No, I didn't.
We could run the tape. You said Catholics are abandoning Donald Trump, not in the same way evangelicals are. So
no, I said Catholics are more offended than evangelicals are.
I was
for
at
sure.
a Catholic gala last night. I go to church. My kids play in Catholic leagues. I don't know one Catholic who was a Trump supporter. I'm not saying there aren't, but who was a Trump supporter who was that offended about the picture, or
You just saw a bunch of them on screen.
or that offended. I'm saying Catholics, or that
They're
offended
Catholic.
by what Trump has done vis-a-vis Iran with respect to what the Pope's criticism was, and is now not supporting the president. I don't know one. I do not know one.
But yeah, the Pope's
we just played some.
They're taking they would rather take Donald Trump, the president, over the Pope, the leader of the church.
Pope polls way better than Donald Trump.
The Pope, I think the Pope is wrong for criticizing America without criticizing the Iranian regime. I think
Isn't
that's
that just about?
I think that's.
But
you know,
but you
we think that the
he's
Pope speaks
excusing
ex
the Iranian
cathedra and
regime?
is infallible on very certain matters. The Pope can be wrong about a lot of things. This happens to be one of them.
But he is talking about peace, and that could be to everyone, right? I mean, when you say peace could be...
But he criticized people for tyrants dropping bombs. I mean, that was a direct
said
attack.
God doesn't bless conflict.
Why did you feel it?
Period. He didn't say God doesn't bless U.S. conflict or God doesn't bless Iran. He said God doesn't bless conflict.
Correct.
There is nothing more anodyne than what the Pope said about war and peace.
St. Augustine has a just war theory, which war is just. This is Catholic tradition.
The Iran war doesn't apply to
Did the Pope cite established Catholic dogma on the just war theory by a
You're
prominent state?
questioning the
He
Pope
did.
citing?
Yes. Yeah, I am actually.
Catholic
You're allowed to.
dogma?
You're allowed to do that.
Well, look, and then so did J.D. Vance.
Yes, he did.
And look, I'm all about just war theory, but somehow I think the objection isn't about misapplication of just war theory and more about criticizing a preemptive war.
By the way, this was the conversation at St. Agnes's Church after Mass this week in Naples, Florida. Just for the record, we were talking about this.
Well, God,
We were talking about this.
With other people, yes.
well, God, if she does exist, I don't think supports war in any form.
I love the parable when the Secretary of War goes out, cheats on his wives, gets wasted, and then quotes Pulp Fiction. That's my favorite parable from the New Testament.
And we will end this part of the show there. Next, more and more MAGA Republicans.
So I love watching S.E. Cupp just laugh at these goons. Joe Belli, Donald Trump, Pete Hegseth, at just how ridiculous they sound and how over the top all of this really is. She brings up the Pope saying that God does not bless conflict. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, yeah, God probably isn't into whataboutism either. You know how it goes, well yeah, the United States is dropping bombs on schools and hospitals and doing double taps and all that, but what about Iran? I mean, come on. I'm pretty sure that's not the message God is sending. It's just all so absurd. And you'd think, at some point, they'd realize how this comes across. And look, Donald Trump can't stop talking. That's just who he is. He goes on and on and on. But you would think his surrogates, people like Mike Johnson, Troy Nehls, and the rest of them, would take a different approach. Maybe just stay quiet and let the storm pass. Let Trump say whatever he's going to say, but don't jump out there trying to spin everything with mental gymnastics and logic pretzels, trying to explain what he really meant, or dragging the Pope into it with endless talking points. Because honestly, if they just kept quiet, a lot of this might blow over faster. But they can't help themselves. They feel the need to constantly defend and praise the so-called dear leader at every moment. And the rest of us? We're just exhausted by it. I mean, seriously, I know I am. And we're still looking at almost 3 more years of this. So I want to hear from you. What do you think about all of this? Do you agree with S.E. Cupp, Josh Rogan, and John Avlon, who were basically calling out Joe Belli on this panel? Or do you side with Joe Belli, where the criticism is aimed more at the Pope than at Donald Trump? And here's something else to think about. A lot of these self-proclaimed Christian, especially Catholic MAGA supporters, like Joe Belli and even Sean Hannity, who's talked about leaving the Catholic Church, do they remember the 10 Commandments? Specifically, the one about having no other gods before God? Because the way it looks, Donald Trump seems to come first for them, above everything else, even above their own stated beliefs. And if that's the case, doesn't that go directly against what they claim to stand for? But consistency isn't really the point here, is it? Hypocrisy doesn't seem to matter in this space. That's just the reality of it. So where do you stand? Are you with S.E. Cupp and the rest of the panel, or are you backing Joe Belli on this one? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear your take. And if you found this breakdown helpful, make sure to